Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So welcome back to this particular course, and today we will be talking about workload and situational analysis method. So there are several methods for this particular topic, so one by one we will be taking it. So before we go into detail about varieties of method which is available for this particular section, first let us understand that what is workload and situational analysis and what we are going to cover under this particular topic. So for this we will be going for four major methodology or methods. Okay, so first is NASA TLX. It's very commonly used tool to understand the mental workload. So NASA task load index and the situation awareness rating technique. Okay, so that we will be doing. Along with we will be doing multiple resource time sharing model. So this model also we will be discussing, critical path analysis and situational awareness global assessment technique. These four methods we will be discussing under this particular section. Okay. So before we go into more detail of each individual methods, first let us understand, because this whole all these topic, all these methods basically related to the mental workload. So let us understand about what is mental workload, and if we measure them, what is the consequences and how it is useful to us. Okay. So the amount of mental resources required to perform a set of concurrent tasks, we will be calling it as mental workload. Okay. So this particular definition, specifically the concept exists from long back. However, this particular definition was given in 2002 by this particular fellow during one of his paper presentation. So what it says, the amount of mental resources. Okay, so maybe the memory, maybe the perception and all other information which is required. So those mental resources, whatever is required to perform a set of concurrent tasks. So if you have a task to finish, so whatever mental requirements are, if you are trying to analyze that we will be taking that we will be calling it as mental workload or cognitive workload. So sustained high mental workload will cause mental fatigue. Of course, it's very similar to all the physical definitions, right? When a muscle is working for more than required time, what will happen? The muscle will get fatigued. So similarly for mental workload also, if it persists for longer hours, longer duration, or the intensity is very high, in that case it will cause some kind of mental fatigue. And of course, if there is a fatigue, it is expected that there will be the decrease in the performance, because once there is a fatigue, of course the performance will get affected, and it is in the deterioration, it actually declines. Okay, and the detrimental health effects in long term. So what happens in the physical fatigue, we realize that fatigue very easily because it becomes prominent. However, in case of mental fatigue, we may not understand or may not realize it on the spot. It's not definite on that particular point of time. However, it has bigger impact than the physical effect or physical fatigue. So, in comparison to the physical fatigue, identifying the mental fatigue is difficult. However, the impact of mental fatigue is very high. Okay. So, Holm in 2009, in his paper they claimed that if there is a sustained high mental workload, it can cause mental fatigue, decreased performance and detrimental health effects in long run. Here again I am saying that physical fatigue identification is very easy, comparatively easy, not very easy, it comparatively easy as compared to mental workload, and the recovery is quite quick, okay, as compared to mental health. Whereas if mental health or mental workload sustained for longer hours, definitely it has very detrimental health effect. Okay. So, before we go into the different methodology, understanding the underload and overload is very important. If in a particular workstation or workplace somebody is feels overload due to different reason or due to different work demand, it can cause the mental fatigue. Whereas in the opposite also, if there is no load filled by that particular person or it cause the underload, then also it can cause detrimental effect or it can cause mental fatigue. So, being an ergonomist, we always look for the optimization between the work demand and the capacity of the mental capacity. Okay. So, if we cannot do the optimization, there will be either overload or underload, and both underload and overload may cause mental fatigue. So, in this photograph you can see it's a image taken from this particular source. So, it's not claiming that we produced it, but this is very important for us to understand this depiction. Okay. So, if it is overload, then lot of problems happen. Okay. So, the person may feel lot of fatigue and the whole performance will deteriorate. Whereas that opposite, if it is underload, then also similar kind of situation will occur. So, mental workload mainly describes the input aspects of the task, the requirements and the demands made by the task on the employee, and if it matches to the capacity or capability of that particular person, it is optimized. If it is not matching, if it is more than that, then overload. If it is less than that, then underload. So, mental workload is a multidimensional characteristics of a task requirement. So, mental workload determines the behavior, it perceives the subjective short-term well-being with consequences for health in long run and psychophysiological processes. So, all these three components, behavior, perception of subjective short-term well-being with the consequences for health and the psychophysiological processes. Okay. So, mental workload determines all these three factors, and based on that consequences, based on that feasibility, only we can understand it is overload or underload. If it is overload, we need to work on the reduction of the requirement, whereas if it is underload, then we need to work on how to utilize that particular person's or operator's capability or capacity in other tasks. Okay, so understanding the mental workload in a particular situation, in a particular workplace is very important, and that's why these tools are or methods are to identify them in the workplace. Okay. So, mental workload, if we talk about, this has major four, what I can say, structure. So, first is the identification of the primary task performance, because when we are talking about a particular task, there will be primary task and secondary task. So, identifying primary task performance and the secondary task performance are the major or basic requirement, and then the physiological measure, because when you are doing a primary task or you are doing a secondary task, you are connected with your the physiological responses. Okay, so that physiological measure, so suppose you are tensed, okay, you are doing some activity where you have a time pressure. Okay, within a stipulated time period you have to finish certain amount of job, so you have a time pressure and then you are doing the job, so that will get reflected on your varieties of physiological responses, maybe breathing, maybe breathing pattern, or maybe cardiovascular cardiorespiratory parameters, or maybe fatigue. Okay, so all these physiological responses need to be checked or need to be measured when we are talking about mental health, as well as the subjective rating. Why subjective rating? Because perception of a particular workload is very subjective in nature. So, if I suppose to read a journal paper of 5 pages, okay, maybe within half an hour or 45 minutes, I may not feel stress, or I feel enjoyable because this particular subject is very much interesting to me. However, the person who is not to this particular field or this particular paper is not connected to his or her interest, this 45 minutes is very much tiring for him or her, right? So, subjective understanding, subjective rating is very important when we are talking about this particular mental workload. So, when we are talking about mental workload measurement, we have to understand what are the primary task performance measure. How do we actually measure the primary task performance? How do we measure the secondary task performance? Primary task performance is like the performance which is directly connected to the goal of the system. Secondary will be surrounding, okay, which are near in that particular environment. So, understanding the primary task performance and the secondary task performance and measuring that is very important for mental workload. Associated physiological measure and subjective ratings. Okay, these 4 components need to be measured when we are talking about mental workload measurement. Now, let us understand in detail with an example for the primary and secondary task. Okay. So, what is the definition? A primary task is defined as the real world task which is the main one has to carry out by that particular person. So, if we talk about cycling, using a bicycle, somebody has to go from one place to another. So, primary task is cycling. So, here you can understand how we have divided these things. So, primary task, what we are saying, you need to understand the road condition, you need to understand the who are the pedestrian in that particular road, then overtaking the cars or bikes, and somebody is coming from the opposite side. So, these understanding is very much important when we are talking about the riding a bicycle. Whereas, secondary task will be what are the number of displays available in this if he or she has some different types of bikes, then if there is some sound alarm, if some kind of vibration alarm, so if some extra arrangements are there in that particular bicycle, how do we perceive it and respond towards that. So that will be the secondary task. So this particular example is given in this particular paper. For more detail you can refer this particular paper. So while doing this particular primary task and secondary task, what are the attentions required? So information, first the information will be processed through the automatic processing units. So first is physical balance. Okay, so when you are riding a bicycle you need to balance it physically, and also you need to control the whole process, like handle the particular bicycle bar and then brake and when to pedal, all these balancing and coordination, propulsion, how it is moving, what is the road condition, based on that how much force you need to apply, all these things are very much required when we are talking about primary task in the bicycle riding. Okay, so you can understand from this particular thing that primary task and secondary task is in a circular mode. So first you give more attention to the primary task and then you get also responses from the secondary task. Now let us understand the definition of secondary task. A secondary task is the peripheral task. Okay, primary task is the main task which he or she need to perform. Okay, without that the system will not function. Whereas secondary tasks are the peripheral task to a primary task in a situation requiring multiple task performance. Okay, so that is called secondary task. We will go for more example with driving simulator, then we can understand it more. Okay, so this secondary task is very much connected to your reaction time. Okay, how quickly you are responding to a particular information. Okay. So the level of mental workload in a task can be directly inferred from measures of attentional capacity. In this secondary task technique, participants are instructed to maintain consistent performance on the primary task. So while performing the secondary task, it is not desired that you are not maintaining the concentration or performance which is required to complete the primary task. So primary task has to be fulfilled, secondary task while doing the secondary task as well. So you cannot compromise on the attention level of primary and secondary task. So differences in workload between primary task are then reflected in the performance of the secondary task. So if the primary task is very crucial, very critical in nature, then it is advised that in the whole design the secondary task or information related to secondary task should be minimal. If that is minimal, then only the person will be able to give more attention to the primary task. However, if there is a diversion, there is always a chance of accident or failure of the system. So designing the percentage contribution in a whole system of the primary task and secondary task is very important, and the decision has to be taken by the designer based on several experiments or experimental results. Okay, so for each context primary and secondary tasks are different and the contribution need to be calculated beforehand so that there is less chance of accident. So optimization of these two combinations are very important. Now if we go again, we take this the earlier example. So what it says that when there is a task shifting, first let us understand what are the primary and secondary tasks in this particular example. It says that observe in the primary task, mainly the observe the road and traffic condition and observe the environmental situation. Okay, whereas in the secondary task, it says that condense the control signals delivered through visual, auditory, tactile or mixed mode. Okay, for these cases, whenever these are going smoothly, someone can pay attention over here definitely, and this is vice versa. It's it's in rotation, so it keeps on getting the feedback. Okay, the same thing we mentioned from the same paper, so you can refer the paper and you can get more detail about it. Okay, now in a particular driving simulator, for this particular example, okay, it's in 2013. So what in this particular simulation technique or simulator, what will they try to do when someone is driving or performing any task in the driving simulator? What are the major tasks or primary tasks available? Okay, so so here they understood first is speed, then is headway, means what is the distance is there between the two car, and the lateral control. Okay, so the simulator records the data about all these three factors based on speed, lateral position and distance from vehicle which is in front of that particular simulator. Okay, so it's a simulator, so they can, and you can understand the speed and headway are connected. No, it's a very complicated situation. If some car is about to stop, okay, you need to judge the speed of the car which is in front, and accordingly you have to control the speed of your car. Also you have to take an account which is coming from behind. So this speed control and the headway understanding is very important, and this is the primary task whenever you are driving, okay, driving on a road. And same thing can be measured in a driving simulator, and this can be using a standard error around the regression line. You can understand this what is the connection between that, what is the actual correlation between that. Okay, now for the secondary task in this particular driving simulator, this particular experiment, what they try to do while driving in a particular type of terrain, type of speed, and the headways are varying continuously in the simulator. In that case, if there is a secondary stimulus, okay, stimulation, then how quickly the driver is responding towards that. In this particular example, you can see they mention there is two figures. Okay, so what they have done, they have one vertical flag and another flag which is rotating from 0, then 90 degree, 180 degree and 270 degree. So as soon as they are rotating at 90 degree, you have to react to it, you have to give a response to it. Okay, so using that particular data or using that particular reaction time data, the person can the researcher can understand how quickly the responses can be grabbed, and if the positions are this, then how the perceptions will be. Okay, so if you want to place maybe switch off your music system. So if there is an error in that particular system, how quickly you will be able to control it. Okay, so if you want to understand that position, location and all those things, maybe using this type of simulation, you can do experiment and you can understand what is the impact of such secondary task on the primary task impact. Okay, so that way it is possible. Now when we are talking about primary task and secondary task and the mental workload, as I mentioned earlier, it is very much connected to your physiological variables. Okay, because when there is a stress, when there is a demand from the work situation, or if there is no demand in that particular workplace or workstation, then definitely there is an impact on the physiological variables. So major variables are heart rate variability, electrodermal responses, so you can get from the skin, and then eye movement and pupillary response, so gaze time, saccadic movement, on all those things. So these experiments may be few of the experiments we can take it up in the laboratory and we may able to see that how it is you need to collect data. Okay, so through using eye tracking system, we can have this type of small experiments. Okay, if there is an simulation, there is a input primary responses, okay, primary data, then how your physiological changes are happening and the event related potential. So all these are the varieties of physiological variables that you can measure. However, these are not only things, you can have more physiological variable based on the type of objective you have in your research. So physiological measures are only applied if they are unobtrusive. Okay, if it is unobtrusive, then only they are applied and reliable and in conjunction with other measures of the workload. Individually these variables may not make any kind of sense. So if you are doing the changes or intensity changes in the primary task, how the physiological responses are changing, so that impact you can see. But individually, if you see in a particular no single condition the physiological responses, that may not interpret your data, it will not be possible to interpret the data. Okay, so if the intensity is changing or frequency is changing or severity is changing of the primary task and secondary task, and what is the impact is there on the responses, physiological responses, that you can measure. So before, after, or 4-5 simulated condition, what is acting best, optimization, those things you can identify using these physiological variables. Subjective rating, again as I mentioned, as mental workload is very much subjective in nature, we really need to understand what is subjective rating. So it's like the only index of true mental workload that is being identified by explained by Hart and Stavelin in 1988. So subjective mental workload scores are sensitive to perceived difficulty. Okay, so that's why I am saying this is very much different from one person to another. The presence of automation, concurrent activities, and the demand for multiple resources. So how they are responding towards all these things. It is sensitive to change the effect when each effort, okay, when each effort maintains primary task performance at stable level, because if the primary task performance differ, then there will be a difficulties to understand the subjective rating. So keeping a primary task level constant, you can see what is the impact is happening from the perception level. Okay, so for us typical set of primary tasks, how that particular primary task is being perceived by different group of people, and how what is the differences are. Okay, so that way the subjective rating will tell which group of people is suitable, are suitable for that particular task. So subjective rating is categorized into two major form, unidimensional and multidimensional. So here as it in a schematic diagram, so unidimensional means to be simpler to apply and analyze but offer only general workload score, whereas multidimensional subjective rating provides some diagnostic for identifying the sources of mental workload. Okay, here for the unidimensional, it's a very much general workload score. So it says yes, there is an workload, mental workload, whereas in the multidimensional there is a chance that you get a direction what is the sources of those mental workload. Okay, so that is the difference. So now let us go into individual tool. Understood? Till here we try to understand what is mental workload, what are the dimensions are available for mental workload. Now we will start with the single method. So first I will start with the NASA TLX. So it is a multi-dimensional subjective workload rating technique. It determines the mental workload of a participant while they are performing a particular task. The subjective experience of workload is defined as an integration of weighted subjective response. So very important, integrated weighted subjective response and the weighted evaluation of the behavior. Okay, so this will give you the indication what are the possible sources of mental workload for a particular situation. So these are the main dimensions, okay, 6 major dimensions when we talk about NASA TLX. So mental demand, physical demand, because mental demand and physical demand, they are both very much connected. If you are physically tired, it may also cause you mentally tired. If you are mentally tired, you may feel you are physically tired. So this understanding the mental demand and physical demand at a single space is very crucial, and this NASA TLX, because it's a multi-dimensional, so it actually gives you a better understanding what are the kind of sources you have for the mental workload. Then temporal demand, effort, performance and frustration level. These are the major 6 dimensions that normally talked in the NASA TLX. So let us understand what are these factors. So mental workload. So mental workload says how much thinking or deciding or calculating is required to perform a particular task. So when you are doing a particular task or when you are performing a particular task, it says that how much thinking is required, how much decision making is there, or how much calculation you need to do before you go for this particular task. That is mental demand. Whereas in physical demand, the amount and intensity of physical activity which is required to complete the task. So force measurement and all those things. Okay. Temporal demand, the amount of time pressure involved in completing that particular task. Effort, how hard does the participant have to work to maintain their level of performance. This is very important. Okay, so again very subjective in nature. So how hard does the participant have to work to maintain their level of performance. Then performance, the level of success in completing that particular task, and frustration level, how insecure, discouraged or secure or content the participant felt during that particular task. Okay, so job satisfaction, it is very much connected to the job satisfaction. So each subscale, okay, so these all are what we can say the domains of NASA TLX, and it has all scaling. Okay, so each subscale of dimensions, all these 6 dimension is presented to the participant either during or after the experimental task. So, depending on what type of experiment you are doing, depending on that you have to produce it. They are asked to rate their score on an interval scale ranging from 1 to 20. 1 represent low and 20 represent high. This involve presenting 15 pair-wise combination to the participant and asking them to select the scale from each pair that has the most effect on the workload during the task under analysis. This particular procedure accounts for 2 potential sources of between rater variability, differences in the workload definition between the raters and the differences in the sources or workload between the tasks. So, let us understand the procedure for NASA TLS. First you need to define the task, conduct of course HTA, we cannot deny HTA whenever we are talking about any mental workload or cognitive behavior analysis. So, HTA for the task under analysis, then select participants based on the goals of the analysis. So, who are the sample, okay. So, sample selection, then what you need to do, you have to brief the participant by explaining the purpose of that particular study that perform that task under analysis. So, whatever task you have done the hierarchical task analysis and the same task to need to be performed by the by those group of people, okay. Follow the weighing procedure and then complete the NASA TLX rating and get the TLX score calculation, okay. So, this is the rating scale identification. Here you have all these dimension mentioned here, and for all the cases starting point is low, high, low, low, here also low, whereas in the performance you have good. From the left hand side it is good, whereas the extreme right hand side it is poor. So, all the cases it is low on the left hand side, extreme right is high, whereas for performance extreme left is good and extreme right is poor. So, what it says? So, first the mental demand, it says how much mental demand and perceptual activity was required. Again it is a perception, right. So, how much mental and perceptual activity was required? For example, thinking, deciding, calculating, remembering, looking, searching, etc. Was the task easy or demanding, simple or complex, exacting or forgiving, okay. So, these type of descriptions you have in the mental demand. Now, coming to physical demand, it talks about how much physical activity was required, okay. So, was that particular task was easy or demanding, slow or very fast, okay, slack or strenuous, restful or laborious. So, you need to understand for all these things you need to give a rating. For temporal, how much time pressure did you feel due to the rate or pace at which the task or task elements need to be carried out or occurred? So, it is very much connected, when there is a workflow, somebody there is a something is coming and you have to do the work. So, those cases it is very much connected. So, was the pace was slow or okay leisurely or very rapid, or it is very difficult to cope up. So, how do you rate them, okay. Then performance, how successful do you think you were in accomplishing the goal of the task set by that particular experimenter. So, how satisfied were you with your performance in accomplishing those goals. So these are the kind of questions you have to ask during the analysis of the data collection of your performance. Then effort, how hard did you have to work to accomplish your level of performance. So you are trying to understand from a person how much effort they need to put for completing that particular task. And the frustration level, again low and maximum is high. So how insecure, discouraged, irritated, stressed or annoyed versus secure, gratified, content, relaxed and complimented. So where it is on the left side or right side, you need to get the answer from the participant about the frustration level while doing that particular job or particular task. Okay, so this is basic description. Now this is how this particular scale looks like. So when we are talking about NASA TLX, there are lot of advantages, also disadvantages. Okay, so first let us understand when we are talking about primary task, secondary task, physiological and subjective responses. Okay, so what are the advantages are? When we are talking about primary task, so direct index of performance we are getting from NASA TLS. It is effective in measuring long periods of workload and performance, overload and individual differences in resources competition. Whereas in the secondary task, it can discriminate between tasks when no differences are observed in primary performance. Okay, so when there is no differences in the primary performance, also it is useful for quantifying short periods of workload, spare attention capacity and even atomicity. Okay, so from NASA TLS for primary task and secondary task, these are the two major advantages. Now coming to physiological factors or physiological raters, it's continuous monitoring of a data and increased sensitivity in measurement does not interfere with primary task performance. Whereas when we talking about subjective rating, it is easy to administer and analyze. It provides an index of perceived strain. Multidimensional measures can be determined the sources of mental workload. Okay, so these are the major advantages for NASA TLX. However, again we have disadvantages as well. So let us understand what are those disadvantages. So based on the context of your application, you need to choose is NASA TLX is helpful or not helpful. Okay, so let us go one by one. Primary task, it cannot distinguish between the tasks if they are within the attentional capacity of the operator. It cannot discriminate, okay, and can be unfeasible or uneconomical to measure in real world condition and not a reliable measure in isolation. So that is for the primary task. For secondary task, only sensitive to gross changes in mental workload, of course. Okay, it cannot do the fine tuning. Okay, can be intrusive, particularly at low levels of primary task workload, must be carefully designed in order to be a true measure of spare attentional capacity. In case of physiological responses, easily it's confounded by the extraneous interference, because suppose heart rate variability, for any other involvement like something extra effort or personal factor actually affect the physiological variables. So for those cases it is actually a disadvantage. So physically obtrusive instrument, difficult to obtain and analyze those data. So when you are talking about mental workload, you need to give the same conditions, very similar condition as actual or as real. However, for physiological data, you really need to have lot of instrument connected. So very difficult for actually getting such data. In case of subjective, can only be administered post task, okay, during task it is not possible, thus influencing the reliability for a long task duration, because if task is very long, what happened in the initial stage and what happened in the last stage of the task, it is like very difficult to understand when the task is completed and you are getting the data. Okay, it's like metacognitive limitations can cloud accurate reporting and difficult to make absolute comparisons between the participants, because absolute comparison is really not possible because it's very subjective in nature. Okay, so these are the disadvantages of NASA TLX. Now let us understand what are the tools required to perform NASA TLX. So for primary and secondary tasks, the tool depends on the application. Data collection for both can be computerized, for example maybe driving simulator or any other simulator where you really need to understand, okay, primary and secondary. So any simulation is possible. Some cases separate laptop or computer desktop can be used for a useful and accurate means of performing a secondary task. Physiological measures require complex monitoring equipment like heart rate monitor, maybe skin conducting monitor, or many other physiology, EMG or many other things, okay, EEG sometimes, okay. So the tools are required according to the physiological experiment demand of, as I mentioned, based on the objective of your research, you need to introduce what are the physiological variables you are looking for. For the subjective measures, mostly the pen and papers are normally being used, because you ask them to rate it on the pen and paper. It can online also, however it is best that you have the data with you, so pen and paper method. Okay, so that's all for NASA TLX. For next class we will be talking about the multi-resource time sharing model. Okay, so you all practice NASA TLX for your context, for your situation. If you have any doubt, we can discuss in the discussion session. Thank you.